She was 19 and had been put out of her father's house with nothing more than a small canvas bag and the clothes on her back. She had no family left to turn to, no plan, and only $12 folded carefully in her pocket. And with that $12, she bought a derelict stone cabin in a remote mountain valley, a place everyone said was cursed. But what nobody knew, what she was about to discover, was that hidden beneath the cabin's broken hearthstone was something that would not only explain the curse, but change her life forever. If you believe in the power of forgotten places and the strength of a quiet heart, follow our channel for more stories like Eliza's. Eliza Mayhew was born in the spring of 1888 in a small, tidy house on the eastern edge of the town of Mill Creek. Her mother, Eleanor, was a woman who seemed to carry the scent of wildflowers and baked bread with her wherever she went, and she taught Eliza the names of the constellations and the birds that nested in the eaves of their home. Her father, Thomas Mayhew, was a clerk for the lumber company, a man of neat ledgers and quiet habits, whose love for his daughter was genuine but expressed in shy, infrequent gestures. For the first 7 years of her life, Eliza's world was small and secure, held together by the rhythm of her mother's humming and the predictable scratch of her father's pen in the evenings. Then, in the autumn of her 7th year, a fever swept through the town, and Eleanor was taken by it. The house fell silent, the scent of wildflowers faded, and Thomas Mayhew retreated further into his ledgers, as if the columns of numbers could impose order on a world that had become unbearably chaotic. A year later, he married Agnes, a widow from a neighboring town, a woman as practical and unadorned as a riverstone. Agnes kept a clean house and managed the budget with fierce efficiency, but she looked at Eliza as another column in the ledger, an expense to be managed, a duty to be fulfilled. In this quiet, emotionally barren landscape, Eliza found a strange and unexpected refuge in the workshop of their neighbor, Silas Blackwood. Silas was a carpenter and widower in his late 60s, a man who had outlived his wife and his only son. His hands were gnarled and stained with wood pitch, but they moved with a slow, certain grace. He spoke little, but he saw the watchful, lonely girl who stood at the edge of his property, peering into the open doors of his workshop. He never invited her in with words. One afternoon, he simply set a small block of soft pine and a whittling knife on a stump just inside the doorway and went back to his work. Eliza hesitated for a long time before she picked them up. From that day forward, the workshop became her school and her sanctuary. Silas taught her everything he knew, not through lectures, but through quiet demonstration. He showed her how to read the grain of a piece of oak, how to feel the readiness of a freshly sharpened plane blade with the ball of her thumb. She learned the different sounds a handsaw makes biting into maple versus pine, and the precise, satisfying tap of a mallet seating a mortise and tenon joint. He taught her how to mix lime mortar, how to judge its consistency by the way it clung to the trowel, and how to lay a fieldstone so it would hold for a century. He never praised her directly, but when she successfully cut her first dovetail joint, he ran his calloused finger over the interlocking pieces and gave a single, slow nod. That nod was more precious to Eliza than any ribbon or award. For her 16th birthday, he gave her a small carving knife of his own making. The blade was fine Swedish steel, and the handle was carved from a piece of apple wood from his own yard, worn smooth and dark with linseed oil. It fit her hand perfectly. It was the only gift she had ever received that felt like it was truly meant for her. It was a tool, not a trinket, a recognition of her competence, of the capable person he saw her becoming. She kept it with her always. The day she was cast out was a Tuesday in late September. She had spent the morning helping Silas repair a fence, and she walked home with the satisfying ache of good work in her shoulders. But when she reached the house, she found the front door locked. This was unusual. On the porch sat her small canvas bag, the one she used for carrying books or supplies. Pinned to it was a folded piece of paper. Her heart did not race. It simply grew still and heavy in her chest, a cold, smooth stone. She recognized the sharp, economical handwriting of her stepmother, Agnes. The note was brief. "Eliza," it read, "you are 19 now, a woman grown. It is time you made your own way in the world. Your father and I have done our duty by you. Your things are in this bag. We wish you well, but do not return here. It would be an inconvenience." There was no signature, but none was needed. She looked through the front window and saw her father sitting at the dining table, his back to her, staring down at one of his ledgers. He did not turn. He did not move. He was a man locked inside his own quiet prison of grief and weakness. Eliza felt a deep, hollow ache, but no tears came. Crying would not change the locked door or the words on the paper. It would not make her father turn around. She had learned from Silas that you do not waste energy on things you cannot fix. You assess the material you have, you take up your tools, and you begin the work that is in front of you. She unpinned the note, folded it, and put it in her pocket. She slid the smooth handle of Silas's carving knife from its sheath, just to feel its familiar weight in her palm. Then she shouldered the small bag, which contained a change of clothes, a bar of soap, and a worn copy of a book her mother had loved. She turned her back on the only house she had ever known, and began to walk west, toward the mountains that rose like a dark promise against the afternoon sky. The road unspooled before her, a ribbon of dust and packed earth leading away from everything familiar. For the first 2 days, she walked through rolling farmland, past tidy homesteads with smoke curling from their chimneys. The smells were of hay and livestock, of wood smoke and damp earth. No one paid her much mind. A young woman walking with a purpose was not an uncommon sight. She slept in barns when she could find one open, burrowing into the hay for warmth, and she ate the last of the bread and cheese she'd had in her pocket. She bought a little more at a crossroads store with a few of the coins she'd saved from odd jobs. The physical act of walking was a strange comfort. The steady rhythm of her own feet on the road, the swing of her arms, the deep pull of air into her lungs. It was a kind of work, and work was something she understood. It kept the hollowness in her chest from consuming her entirely. On the 3rd day, the landscape began to change. The gentle hills gave way to steeper inclines, and the farms grew smaller and farther apart. The air grew thinner, sharper, scented with pine and the cold mineral tang of stone. The road became a track, winding its way up into the foothills of the Cobalt Mountains. This was unfamiliar territory, wilder and more formidable than the neat world she had left behind. She saw deer moving like ghosts through the trees at dusk and heard the cry of a hawk circling high overhead. She felt small here, but not afraid. The vastness of the mountains was an honest thing. It didn't pretend to be welcoming, it simply was. It made the quiet cruelty of her father's house seem petty and distant. She was walking toward Whisper Creek Valley, a place she had only heard of in passing. A remote valley rumored to have good water and unclaimed land. On the evening of the 4th day, she crested a high ridge and saw it spread out below her. The valley was a deep green bowl carved between 2 towering peaks, a silver creek winding through its center. A handful of lights twinkled near the valley mouth, a tiny settlement clinging to the edge of the wilderness. She stood there for a long time as the sun set, bathing the peaks in shades of rose and violet. She felt a stillness settle over her, the first she had felt since finding the note on her bag. This was a place where a person could start over. This was a place where a person could build something that was their own. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder and began the long walk down into the valley. The settlement at the mouth of Whisper Creek was little more than a general store, a blacksmith's forge, and a half-dozen houses. The man who ran the store also served as the land agent. His name was Arthur Abernathy, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and whose suspenders seemed to be the only thing holding his stooped frame together. He peered at Eliza over a pair of spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Looking for work?" he asked, his voice a dry rustle. "I'm looking for a place," Eliza said, her own voice steady. "Some land. A cabin, maybe." Abernathy grunted and pulled a large, leather-bound book from under the counter. "Not much for sale. The Miller place is spoken for. The old logging camp is too far up canyon. There is one property." He paused, tapping a long finger on a page. "The Vance place. Stone cabin, 5 acres, right on the creek. Been empty for 10 years now." "Why has it been empty so long?" Eliza asked. He took off his spectacles and polished them on his shirt. "Bad luck follows that place. Esther and Samuel Vance built it. Good people. Lost their boy, Daniel, to the winter fever. A year later, Samuel was killed in a rock slide at the old silver mine. Esther. She stayed on for another year, all alone. Then one day, she was just gone. Packed a bag and walked out. No one ever saw her again. Folks say the place holds on to its grief. They call it the cursed cabin. No one who's tried to live there since has stayed more than a season." Eliza was quiet for a moment, thinking of the grief that haunted her own father's house. A place that held its grief openly seemed more honest somehow. "How much?" she asked. Abernathy looked at her worn dress and the small bag at her feet. "The county wants $12 for the deed, just to clear it from the books." It was every cent she had. "I'll take it," she said, without hesitation. He stared at her, then shrugged, as if the folly of youth was a force of nature beyond his control. He filled out the deed in a spidery hand, and Eliza counted out her $12 onto the worn wooden counter. The cabin was a mile up the creek from the settlement. The path was overgrown, but the sound of the water was a constant, soothing companion. And then she saw it. It was set back from the creek in a small clearing, nestled against a stand of tall ponderosa pines. The foundation and lower walls were made of large, expertly fitted river stones, a testament to Samuel Vance's skill. The upper walls were sturdy logs, now grayed with weather. The sod roof was overgrown with grass and wildflowers, but the ridgepole looked straight and true. One window was broken, a dark, gaping eye, and the heavy plank door hung crookedly from a single leather hinge. Weeds choked what had once been a small garden. Others saw a ruin, a place of bad luck and sorrow. Eliza saw the good bones. She saw the work of Silas in the tight-fitting stonework and the notched logs. She saw a place that had been built with love and skill, a place that was simply waiting for a pair of capable hands to tend to it again. She walked to the crooked door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust, damp earth, and the faint, lingering scent of a long dead wood fire. It was the smell of a place that had been waiting. For the first few weeks, Eliza worked from dawn until dusk, fueled by a fierce and quiet determination. She swept out the years of accumulated dust, leaves, and mouse nests, She used Silas's knife to cut away the rotted leather hinge on the door, and after a full day of labor, re-hung it using new hinges she fashioned from scavenged strap iron she'd found near the old mine. She patched the hole in the roof, weaving a mat of willow branches and packing it with fresh sod and clay from the creek bank. She spent 2 days carefully removing the broken shards of glass from the window frame and fitting a new pane she bought from Mr. Abernathy with the first dollar she earned doing mending for his wife. The cabin was small, just a single room about 16 feet square, with a sleeping loft above. But it was solid, and with each small repair, it felt more like her own. The heart of the cabin was the large stone hearth that took up most of the back wall. It was a magnificent thing, built for warmth and cooking, but it had a serious flaw. The hearthstone itself, a single massive slab of flat granite, was cracked clear across the middle and had settled unevenly, creating a dangerous tripping hazard and a place for embers to escape. It had to be fixed before she could safely use the fireplace for the winter. This was work that tested the limits of her strength. She found a long, sturdy log to use as a lever and a smaller, rounded stone for a fulcrum. Day after day, she worked at it, slowly, patiently, inching the massive stone upward. Finally, with a great groaning sound, the stone lifted free of its bed of sand and earth. And there, in the hollowed-out space beneath where the center of the stone had rested, was a small, dark object wrapped in oilskin. It was a package, about the size of a loaf of bread, tied securely with twine. Her first thought was that it was a surveyor's mark, or something left by the builders. But it felt too deliberate, too carefully placed. With hands trembling slightly from exertion and a sudden sharp curiosity, she carried the package to the doorway where the light was better. She used Silas's knife to carefully slit the twine. She peeled back the stiff, waxy layers of oilskin. Inside was a small, neatly stacked pile of $20 gold coins, their surfaces gleaming dully in the afternoon light. Beneath the coins was a folded letter, the paper yellowed with age, and resting beside it was a single, smooth, dark river stone, the kind a child might pick up and save for its perfect shape. She carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting was clear and steady. A woman's hand. It began, "To whoever finds this, in this house I built with my husband, Samuel. My name is Esther Vance. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has not gone as I had hoped." Eliza sat down on the threshold, the cool stone beneath her, and began to read the story of the house, the story of the curse. The letter was dated June of 1878. "My husband Samuel and I came to this valley with our son, Daniel, who was then 6 years old," Esther wrote. "We built this cabin with our own hands, stone by stone, log by log. Samuel was a stonemason, and he said the stones of this creek were the strongest he had ever seen. For 5 years, this was a happy place. Daniel loved this valley more than anyone. He would spend his days exploring the creek, and his pockets were always full of treasures. Smooth stones, bird feathers, strangely shaped twigs. This dark, smooth stone was his favorite. He called it his lucky stone. We were saving for his future. Every extra dollar we earned, we put away. Samuel worked part-time at the silver mine, and I sold butter and eggs in the settlement. We dreamed of sending Daniel to a school in the East, to become a doctor or an engineer, to have a life bigger than this valley. This money, $180 in gold, was for him. It was his future, hidden here under the heart of our home." The tone of the letter shifted, the careful script becoming slightly less steady. "Then came the winter of '77. A fever took our boy. He was gone in 3 days. The light went out of this house, out of our lives. Samuel kept working, but his heart was broken. He became reckless at the mine. The following spring, there was a rock slide. He was gone too. I was left alone in this house we built together, surrounded by ghosts and the future we had saved for, a future that would never come. This money became a weight, a constant reminder of all I had lost. I could not spend it. It was Daniel's. And so, I am leaving it here. I am leaving this valley to find a place where the memories are not in every stone and every gust of wind. I do not know where I am going, but I leave this here with a prayer. To whoever finds this, I hope you are in need. I hope you are building a life here. Use this money to make this house a home again. Use it to build a future. Do not let this place be a place of sorrow. Let it be a place of new beginnings. Look after our home. And please, if you have a moment, take Daniel's lucky stone down to the creek for him. Let it feel the water one more time. May your life here be blessed with peace. Eliza sat for a long time, the letter in her lap, the heavy gold coins in one hand and the small, cool stone in the other. The cabin was no longer just a structure of wood and stone. It was a vessel of love and loss, a repository of a family's broken dreams. The curse wasn't a malevolent spirit. It was the profound, lingering weight of Esther Vance's sorrow, a grief so heavy she could not bear to stay. Eliza looked around the dusty room, at the solid stone walls Samuel had built, at the hearth that had protected his family's future. She felt a deep and binding connection to these people she had never met. She was not an intruder here. She was an heir. Esther's hope had lain dormant under the stone for a decade, waiting for someone to find it. And it had found her. She closed her eyes and made a silent promise to the ghosts of the Vance family. She would not let this be a place of sorrow. She would build a new beginning. The discovery of Esther's savings changed everything. It was not just the money, though the $180 was a small fortune that lifted the crushing weight of precarity from her shoulders. It was the purpose the letter gave her. She was no longer just a survivor seeking shelter. She was a custodian, tasked with honoring the legacy of the family who had built this place. Her work took on a new, reverent quality. The next morning, she walked into the settlement with a new confidence in her step. She went to Mr. Abernathy's store and bought the things she truly needed: a good quality axe head, a sack of nails, a bag of lime for mortar, and a dozen cedar shingles. Mr. Abernathy looked at the gold coin she placed on the counter, his eyebrows rising nearly to his hairline, but he asked no questions. The people of these mountains respected privacy. Her first major project was the hearth. She knew from Silas that a cracked hearthstone was a house fire waiting to happen. She needed help. She asked Mr. Abernathy who the best stonemason in the valley was. "That would be Jedediah Stone," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "Man's name matches his trade. Lives up the North Fork." Eliza found him working on a new foundation for the blacksmith's shop. He was an older man, quiet and weathered, with hands as large and solid as mallets. She explained her problem, expecting to hire him. He listened patiently, then said, "I knew Samuel Vance. He was a good man and a better mason. I'll come take a look." He arrived at her cabin the next day. He inspected the cracked stone and the foundation of the hearth, running his hand over Samuel's work with an expert's appreciation. "Good work," he murmured. "Solid." He showed her how to mix the lime mortar to the perfect consistency, not with measurements, but by feel. Together they cleaned the hollow beneath the hearth, and Eliza told him, simply, that she had found something left behind by the previous owner. He just nodded. They decided the cracked stone was too great a risk. Over the next 3 days, Jedediah helped her select, move, and fit 3 smaller, perfectly flat stones to replace the single large one. He taught her how to use shims to level them and how to tool the mortar joints for a clean, tight seal. He refused any payment. "Call it a professional courtesy," he said, looking at the finished hearth. "For Samuel." With the hearth secure, she turned her attention to the walls. The chinking between the logs had crumbled away in many places, leaving gaps for the wind to whistle through. She spent a week down by the creek, mixing a slurry of clay, sand, and dried grass, just as Silas had shown her. She packed the mixture into the gaps with her hands and a small trowel. It was slow, messy, satisfying work. Each sealed gap was a victory against the coming winter. She built furniture from salvaged wood she found at the abandoned mine site. A sturdy table, a 3-legged stool, and a bed frame in the loft. She used the joinery Silas had taught her, cutting mortise and tenon joints that fit together snugly without a single nail. The work was hard, but it filled her days and quieted her mind. Every evening, she would light a small fire in her new, safe hearth, and the cabin would fill with a warm, flickering light. It was becoming a home. As the cabin slowly came back to life, so too did Eliza's connection to the small community around her. Her solitary labor had not gone unnoticed. People were accustomed to seeing the Vance place as a decaying monument to sorrow, a place to be hurried past. Now they saw a thin but steady plume of smoke rising from the chimney each morning. They saw a neatly patched roof and a solid, straight-hanging door. They saw work, and in this valley, work was a language everyone understood and respected. The first to bridge the distance was Sarah Miller, a farmer's wife from down the valley. She appeared at Eliza's door one afternoon holding a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and work-roughened hands. "I saw your smoke," she said, her voice warm. "Thought you might be tired of your own cooking." Inside the basket were a fresh loaf of sourdough bread, a jar of blackberry preserves, and a wedge of cheese. It was more than just food. It was an offering of welcome. Eliza, unaccustomed to such open kindness, could only manage a quiet thank you. But the gratitude in her eyes was clear. Aurora just smiled. "We look after our own here." The visit became a weekly ritual. Sarah would bring bread or fresh eggs, and Eliza would give her a small bundle of the wild mint she'd found growing by the creek. They rarely spoke for long, but a bond of quiet friendship formed in those small exchanges. Jedediah Stone came by a few weeks later, ostensibly to check on the hearth. He brought with him a box of old, but well-cared-for tools that had belonged to his father: a draw knife, an adze, a set of wood chisels. "No use them sitting in my barn," he said gruffly, avoiding her eyes. "A tool needs to be used." Eliza took them with reverence, knowing the immense value of such a gift. She used the draw knife to shape new legs for a bench and the chisels to carve a small shelf to hold her few possessions. Even old Mr. Abernathy seemed to thaw. When she came into the store to buy seeds for a small garden, he added a packet of marigold seeds to her bag. "For luck," he said. "My wife swears by them." The townsfolk stopped calling her cabin the Vance place or the cursed cabin. Now, when they gave directions, they would say, "Go on past Eliza Mayhew's place." She had a name. She had a place. The ghosts of the cabin had not been exorcised. They had been honored. The sorrow had not been erased. It had been integrated into a new story of resilience and renewal. One crisp autumn afternoon, as she was splitting firewood, she fulfilled the last part of her promise to Esther. She took the small, dark river stone from the shelf where she kept it, walked down to the creek, and knelt at the water's edge. She held the stone in the cold, clear current, letting the water rush over it, just as it had when a little boy named Daniel had first picked it up. She didn't say any words aloud, but she sent a silent message of peace out into the quiet valley. The stone, now clean and dark, felt like a connection, a link in a chain of care that stretched back through time. The first snow of winter arrived in early December, falling in thick, silent flakes that blanketed the valley in white. Inside her cabin, Eliza was warm and secure. A stew made with dried beans and a piece of salted pork she'd bought at the store simmered over the fire, filling the single room with a rich, savory steam. The fire crackled in the hearth that she and Jedediah Stone had rebuilt, its stones radiating a deep, steady warmth. The wind howled outside, rattling the pines, but inside, all was calm. The walls, freshly chinked with her own hands, held the wind at bay. The light from the fire danced across the log walls, across the simple, sturdy furniture she had built, across the small shelf next to the hearth. On that shelf sat two objects, side by side. One was the carving knife Silas Blackwood had given her, its applewood handle worn to a deep, familiar patina. It represented the skills she had been taught, the quiet belief of a kind old man who had seen her worth when no one else had. It was the tool that had allowed her to begin. The other object was the smooth, dark river stone that had belonged to Daniel Vance. It represented the gift she had been given, the unexpected grace of a stranger who had turned her own profound loss into a hope for the future. It was the means that had allowed her to build. She sat on her stool, looking from one object to the other, and felt the threads of her life pulling together. She thought of her father, a man trapped by his own sorrow, unable to see past the ledger of his own loss. She thought of her stepmother, for whom life was a series of transactions, of duties performed and columns balanced. Theirs was a cold and brittle world. And then she thought of the warmth that surrounded her now. The warmth of Silas's unspoken faith. The warmth of Esther Vance's desperate, beautiful hope. The warmth of Jedediah's gruff generosity and Sarah Miller's quiet friendship. They were a family of a different kind, one forged not by blood, but by shared work, by mutual respect, by the simple, profound act of showing up for one another. The world had cast her out with nothing, but in this forgotten cabin, in this valley at the edge of the world, she had found everything. She had found a home. She had found a community. She had found herself. Eliza Mayhew was 19 and had been put out on her own. She had $12 to her name, and she spent it all on a cursed cabin in Whisper Creek Valley. It was the best $12 she ever spent. The story of Eliza Mayhew is a reminder that a home is more than just a shelter. It is a place we build, both with our hands and with our hearts. It shows that what one person sees as a curse, another can see as an opportunity for care and renewal. If this story of finding a future in a place others had abandoned resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing it with someone who appreciates the quiet strength of the human spirit. And we leave you with this thought. What have you found of value in a place or a person that others had already given up on? What would you do if the only thing you could afford was the one thing no one else wanted? If your last $4 had to choose between a hot meal and a broken-down animal, a creature the world had already written off as worthless. For one man, That choice led him not to ruin, but to a treasure beyond anyone's wildest imagination. He paid $4 for a blind stallion bound for the slaughterhouse, a purchase that earned him the scorn of an entire town. But what happened next, in the quiet desolation of the frontier, would prove that sometimes the things we dismiss hold the deepest secrets. Stay close and let this story remind you that the greatest discoveries are often made when we learn to see with more than just our eyes. The dust of Redemption Gulch settled on Ethan Vance like a second skin, a fine grit that worked its way into the creases of his worn coat and the lines around his eyes. He had arrived on foot, leading nothing, carrying less. The town's name was a bitter irony he didn't have the energy to appreciate. There was no redemption here, only the hard, unblinking stare of a place that had seen too many men like him. Men who carried their pasts in the slump of their shoulders and the hollowness of their gaze. He had lost his ranch to the drought, his wife to the fever that followed, and his name to the whispers that blamed him for both. All that remained was a stubborn refusal to lie down and die, and the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke and chamomile that he sometimes caught on the wind, a ghost of the life he'd once known. He walked the single-planked street, his boots scuffing a rhythm of defeat against the boards. Doors to the mercantile, the smithy, the saloon, they all seemed to close a little tighter as he passed. He sought work, but his hands, though calloused and capable, were attached to a man who looked like a harbinger of bad luck. "Nothing today," the livery owner muttered, not meeting his eye. "Full up," the freight manager said, turning back to his ledger. Each rejection was a quiet, steady blow, chipping away at the small reserve of hope he'd carried into town. He had a few coins left, enough for a stale biscuit and a cup of weak coffee. But hunger was a familiar ache, one he could manage. It was the other hunger, the one for a foothold, for a single square foot of earth that wouldn't crumble beneath him, that gnawed at his soul. That evening, he found himself at the edge of town, where the respectable world frayed into a landscape of broken wagons and discarded dreams. A small, pathetic auction was underway near the knackery, the air thick with the smell of cheap livestock and despair. The auctioneer, a man with a stained waistcoat and a tired voice, was trying to sell off the dregs. It was there, tied to a splintered post, that Ethan first saw him. A stallion, broad-chested and proud, with the clean lines of a thoroughbred. His coat was the color of a midnight storm, matted with mud and burrs. But even in his neglect, there was a power in his stance, a defiant stillness that set him apart from the other broken-down animals. Then Ethan saw his eyes. They were clouded over, two milky orbs that stared into nothing. The horse was blind. A ripple of cruel laughter went through the small crowd. "What's the use of a horse that can't see the trail?" someone called out. The auctioneer sighed. "He's strong, got good bone. Good for stud, maybe, or glue. Let's start the bidding at $10. Silence. The wind whistled through the fence posts. A big, prosperous rancher named Silas Croft, who owned half the valley, spat a stream of tobacco juice near the stallion's hooves. "I wouldn't give you 10 cents for that useless nag. Put him out of his misery." The auctioneer's shoulders slumped. $5 then. "Anyone?" $4, just to cover my time." More silence. The stallion stood unmoving, his head held high as if he could hear every word and refused to let it touch him. In that moment, Ethan saw not a useless animal, but a reflection of himself, discarded, damaged, but with an unbroken spirit. He felt the 4 heavy dollar coins in his pocket. They were his last. He stepped forward, his voice raspy from disuse. $4. The auctioneer's head snapped up. The crowd turned to stare. Silas Croft let out a booming laugh. But the deal was done. Ethan Vance, a man with nothing, had just spent everything he had on a blind horse. The weight of the lead rope in his hand felt less like a burden and more like an anchor in a world that had set him adrift. The laughter of the crowd followed him like a swarm of biting flies, but Ethan Vance didn't look back. He simply took the stallion's lead and walked away from the knackery, his worn-out boots and the horse's unshod hooves kicking up small puffs of indifferent dust. In the fading light, the horse's coat looked less like midnight and more like deep, bruised twilight. He was thinner than Ethan had first thought, the sharp lines of his ribs visible beneath the matted hair. Yet he walked with a strange, unnerving grace, his head up, his ears swiveling constantly, reading the world in a language of sound and vibration that Ethan could only guess at. He placed a hand on the stallion's neck. The muscle beneath was tense but not fearful. There was a deep, quiet intelligence in the animal, a trust given cautiously, but given all the same. Ethan felt a kinship so profound it almost buckled his knees. Here was another soul the world had deemed broken, another creature living in a world it could no longer see, navigating by memory and instinct alone. He decided to call him Shadow, for the way he seemed to move without a sound, a dark, silent form against the dying day. As he led Shadow through the main street of Redemption Gulch, the town's judgment was swift and absolute. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped their conversations on the saloon porch to stare and whisper. Vance's folly, he heard someone mutter, and the name stuck. It became a piece of town lore before he'd even reached the other side. Silas Croft, mounted on a magnificent bay gelding that shone with good health and expensive grooming, trotted up beside them. He looked down from his high saddle, a smirk playing on his lips. "Well, Vance?" he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Found yourself a fitting partner, I see. Two blind fools stumbling in the dark. What are you going to do with him? Teach him to read rocks?" Croft's cronies laughed along with him. Ethan didn't rise to the bait. He met Croft's gaze for a brief, silent moment, his own eyes as hard and unreadable as river stones, then turned his attention back to the horse, murmuring a low, soothing word. His silence was more potent than any retort. It was a wall Croft's mockery couldn't breach. He simply walked on. Why would a man with nothing spend his last dollar on a horse that couldn't see? What secret did the animal hold in its silent, milky eyes? And what instinct drove a broken man to see value where everyone else saw only a liability? Let us know in the comments what you think was going through Ethan's mind in that moment. And if you're finding a place in your heart for this story, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. Because the path this blind stallion would lead him down started not with sight, but with a sound only he could hear. He left the town behind, the whispers and laughter fading into the vast, open silence of the high desert. He walked until the last lamplit window of Redemption Gulch was just a tiny spark behind him. On the far edge of the valley, where the good grazing land gave way to rock and scrub, he found a small, forgotten parcel of land. It was a place nobody wanted, marked by a collapsed lean-to and a choked, dry creek bed that snaked through the property like an old scar. It was here he would make his stand. There was no one to judge him here, only the wind and the sky and the quiet company of his blind horse. As he passed a final, dilapidated cabin set far back from the dusty track, a figure on the porch caught his eye. It was an old woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. The town called her Alara, a recluse who spoke more to the crows than to people. She watched him and the horse approach, her gaze lingering not on Ethan, but on Shadow, as they drew level with her gait. Her voice, thin and reedy as a bird's call, cut through the evening air. "Some creatures," she said, her words deliberate and weighted, "see the world not as it is, but as it was meant to be." Ethan stopped. He looked at the old woman, then at his horse. He didn't understand her meaning, but he felt the truth of it settle in his bones. He gave a slow, respectful nod, a gesture of acknowledgement between two people who lived on the margins. Then he continued on, the cryptic words echoing in his mind as he led Shadow onto the barren patch of earth that was now their home. The land was as broken as he was. Jagged rocks pushed up through the thin soil like broken teeth, and the sagebrush grew in stubborn, thorny clumps. The lean-to was little more than a pile of weathered planks and rusted nails, offering no real shelter from the elements. A lesser man would have seen only desolation, a final confirmation of his failure. But Ethan Vance saw something else. He saw a beginning. It was a place where he could be invisible, where he could heal without the prying eyes of the world upon him. He had nothing to lose, which meant he had everything to gain. He spent his first night under the vast, star-dusted sky, with Shadow standing nearby. The horse didn't lie down, but stood a silent, motionless sentinel, his breathing a slow, rhythmic comfort in the profound quiet of the wilderness. Ethan slept fitfully, the hard ground an unforgiving mattress, but for the first time in months, he didn't feel entirely alone. The presence of the animal beside him was a steady, living warmth against the cold loneliness that had been his constant companion. His first priority was not himself, but the horse. He used the last of his energy to clear a small corral of the sharpest rocks, creating a safe space for Shadow to move. He had no money for oats or hay, so he spent hours gathering what little hardy grass he could find, growing in the crevices of the creek bed. He'd learned from his father long ago that you care for your animal before you care for yourself, a principle that was etched into his very being. He found a small spring trickling from a rock formation, the water clean and cold, and led Shadow to it. The horse drank deeply, trusting Ethan's guidance completely. Days were spent in a simple, grueling routine. Ethan would work on the land, clearing stones, pulling brush, his muscles aching with the effort. Shadow would stand nearby, his blindness making him a passive observer, yet his presence was a constant motivation. Ethan began talking to him, not out of foolishness, but out of a deep-seated need for connection. He told the horse about his wife, Sarah, about the color of her eyes and the way she used to hum when she worked in her garden. He spoke of his old ranch, the rolling green hills that were now just a painful memory. The horse would listen, his ears twitching, occasionally turning his head as if to catch every word. It was in these quiet moments of shared existence that Ethan began to notice the true nature of Shadow's senses. The horse's hearing was unnaturally acute. A rock slide miles away would cause his ears to pivot long before Ethan heard the faint rumble. The cry of a hawk circling high overhead would make him lift his head, tracking its movement across the sky as if he could see it perfectly. He navigated their small, rocky camp with an eerie precision, never stumbling, never misjudging a distance. He seemed to have a mental map of the terrain, one he updated with every shift of the wind and every crunch of gravel underfoot. He was not a disabled creature. He was differently abled, his remaining senses heightened to a degree that was almost supernatural. It was a humbling realization. Ethan had bought the horse out of pity, out of a sense of kinship with another broken thing. But as he watched Shadow move through their shared world, he began to suspect that it was the horse who was the whole one, and he who was blind to the deeper truths of their surroundings. The world was speaking in a language he had forgotten how to hear, but Shadow understood every word. A week bled into the next, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. Ethan's hands grew raw, then healed into a tougher layer of callus. His body, once weakened by grief, grew lean and hard with labor. He had managed to trade a day's work clearing a path for a neighboring homesteader, a man as poor and reserved as himself, for a sack of flour and some beans. It was meager sustenance, but it was enough. Throughout it all, Shadow was his shadow, a constant, quiet companion. It was during one of these long, monotonous evenings that the horse's strange ritual began. As the sun dipped below the western ridge, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Shadow would stop whatever he was doing, be it grazing on sparse grass or dozing in the sliver of shade cast by a large boulder, and walk with deliberate steps to the far end of their small property. He would always stop in the exact same spot, a flat, dusty patch of ground right before a sheer rock face that formed the northern boundary of the land. There, he would stand perfectly still, his body aligned with the rock, and lower his head until his muzzle was just inches from the ground. His ears, those incredible instruments of perception, would angle forward, twitching minutely, aimed directly at the base of the stone wall. He would stay like that for 10, sometimes 15 minutes, as motionless as a statue carved from obsidian. He seemed to be listening, not to the world outside, but to something deep within the earth itself. The first few times it happened, Ethan paid it little mind. Animals had their quirks, their strange habits born of instinct and repetition. He thought perhaps the horse was sensing water deep underground, or maybe the vibrations of some nocturnal creature burrowing beneath the surface. He went to the spot himself, knelt down, and pressed his own ear against the cool, rough surface of the rock. He heard nothing. There was only the low moan of the wind coursing through the valley and the faint, high-pitched ringing of his own exhaustion. He patted Shadow's neck, murmured, "Nothing there, boy," and led him back toward their camp. But the horse was insistent. Every single evening, without fail, as the light began to fade, he would repeat the journey. The ritual never varied by an inch or a second. It was precise, methodical, and deeply focused. Ethan started to watch more closely, his curiosity piqued by the animal's unwavering conviction. This was not a random act. It was intentional. There was a purpose to it that he couldn't yet fathom. The rock face itself was unremarkable, a sheer wall of granite and sandstone, no different from 100 other formations in the valley. But to Shadow, it was a place of immense significance. It was a focal point, a destination. One evening, a coyote howled from a nearby ridge, a sound that usually sent Shadow's ears swiveling in its direction. But while he stood at his listening post, he didn't even flinch. His entire being was concentrated on the silent rock in front of him. What was he hearing? What secret did the earth hold in this one specific place that only a blind horse could perceive? The question settled in Ethan's mind, a small, persistent seed of wonder. He didn't have an answer, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of something other than loss. He felt a mystery beginning to unfold. The seed of wonder planted by Shadow's ritual began to grow. Ethan's life was still a matter of pure survival, a daily struggle for calories and warmth. But now it had a new focus. His labor, once a simple act of clearing land, became an investigation, He started working his way methodically across the property, moving from the collapsed lean-to toward the rock face at the northern edge. Each stone he moved, each root he tore from the dry soil, felt like turning a page in a book he didn't know he was reading. Shadow was always there, a silent supervisor. The horse would stand off to the side, out of the way of the swinging pickaxe and the flying debris, his posture calm and patient. But Ethan noticed that as his work brought him closer to the mysterious rock wall, Shadow's demeanor would shift subtly. The horse would become more attentive, his stillness charged with a kind of anticipation. His ears would remain fixed on the spot where Ethan was digging, tracking the sound of his tools striking the earth. As he cleared the ground within 20 yards of the rock face, Ethan began to notice small anomalies. The composition of the soil changed. It became softer, less compacted, with a strange, bluish-green tinge in the dirt that stained his hands. The rocks he pulled from the ground here were different, too. They weren't the plain granite and sandstone that littered the rest of the property. Many were laced with faint, delicate veins of turquoise and a deeper, more vibrant blue he didn't recognize. He wasn't a prospector, but he'd lived in the West long enough to know the land sometimes held secrets in its colors. He set a few of the more interesting stones aside, his curiosity growing with each one he unearthed. He was still driven by the practical need to create a small patch of arable land for a garden, but a new, more compelling question now drove him. What was buried here? One sweltering afternoon, he was wrestling with a particularly large, deeply embedded boulder about 10 feet from the base of the wall. He had been digging around it for an hour, the sun beating down on his back, sweat stinging his eyes. He swung his pickaxe, aiming for the earth beneath the rock to loosen its hold. Instead of the familiar grating crunch of steel on stone, the tool hit with a dull, resonant thud. It was the sound of metal striking wood. He froze, his arms trembling with exertion. The sound was wrong. Wood had no business being buried this deep, not here. He looked over at Shadow. The horse, who had been dozing lightly in a sliver of shade, was now wide awake. His head was high, his ears locked forward, pointed directly at the spot where the pickaxe had landed. A low, guttural nicker rumbled in his chest. It wasn't a sound of alarm, but of confirmation. In that instant, the pieces clicked into place in Ethan's mind. The horse's nightly ritual, the strange soil, the colored rocks, and now this. Shadow hadn't just been listening to the earth. He had been listening to this. He had been guiding Ethan to this exact spot all along, with a patience and wisdom that defied all logic. A surge of adrenaline cut through his fatigue. He dropped to his knees and began to dig with his bare hands, clawing at the dirt around the point of impact, his heart hammering against his ribs. The earth was about to give up its secret. The sun began its slow descent, but Ethan barely noticed. He worked with a feverish intensity, his earlier exhaustion forgotten. He scraped away the dirt and rock, revealing the source of the thud. A heavy, rough-hewn wooden beam, its surface dark and warped by time and moisture. It wasn't just a random piece of timber. It was part of a larger structure. Following its line, he dug a trench, his hands raw and bleeding, his muscles screaming in protest. He unearthed another beam, then another, forming a crude, rectangular frame. It was a doorway, a collapsed entrance to a mine shaft, deliberately and carefully buried under tons of rock and soil. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide this place, to erase it from the landscape. He paused, leaning on his shovel, breathing heavily. He looked at the hidden entrance, then back at Shadow, who stood watching him, his silhouette dark against the vibrant sunset. The horse had led him here. The quiet, broken creature he had saved from death was, in fact, his savior. With the last of his strength, he used his pickaxe as a lever, prying at the rotted timbers that blocked the entrance. They groaned in protest, then splintered and gave way, revealing a dark, narrow opening. A rush of cool, stale air washed over him, smelling of deep earth, dampness, and something else. A faint, metallic tang, like the air after a lightning strike. He retrieved his lantern, his hands shaking slightly as he struck a match and lit the wick. The small flame cast a flickering, golden glow, pushing back the oppressive darkness. Taking a deep breath, he ducked his head and stepped across the threshold, leaving the world of sunlight and wind for the silent, waiting belly of the earth. The shaft was small and crudely dug, clearly the work of one person. It descended at a gentle angle for no more than 20 feet before ending in a small, cavernous chamber. He raised the lantern high, its light dancing across the walls, and then he saw it. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a vein of gold or a seam of silver. It was something far more beautiful. The back wall of the chamber was a breathtaking tapestry of color. A massive, solid vein of rock shot through with brilliant streaks of sky blue, deep azure, and vibrant sea green, pulsed in the lamplight. It looked as if a piece of the summer sky had been trapped underground. He had never seen anything like it. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cool, smooth surface. It was turquoise and azurite, but of a purity and concentration that was legendary. The kind of find old prospectors whispered about around campfires, but never truly believed existed. On a small hand-carved shelf in the rock beside the vein sat a small rust-eaten tin box. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a slim, leather-bound journal. The ink was faded, the handwriting a spidery scrawl, but it was legible. It was the diary of a prospector named Jedediah Stone, dated 50 years prior. It told the story of his solitary search, his discovery of this incredible vein, and his overwhelming fear of claim jumpers. He had hidden the mine's entrance, planning to return and file a proper claim. But the journal's entries grew erratic, speaking of a fever and a growing weakness. The final entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, read, "The earth here sings a blue song, if you know how to listen for it. I fear I am the only one who ever will." Ethan closed the journal, his heart full. He looked back toward the mine's entrance, where the silhouette of his blind stallion stood, patiently waiting. Jedediah had been wrong. Someone else had heard the song. Just as the weight of the discovery settled upon him, the world outside began to change. The sky, which had been clear and painted with the gentle colors of dusk, had turned a bruised, menacing purple. The wind, once a low whisper, began to howl, whipping dust and debris against the rock face. A storm was coming, one of those sudden, violent tempests that could appear out of nowhere in the high country. Ethan felt a deep unease. His first instinct was to protect the mine. An unprotected shaft like this could flood in minutes, the torrents of water turning it into a muddy, impassable grave, potentially collapsing the entire structure and burying the vein forever. He scrambled out of the entrance just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, cold and heavy. The air crackled with electricity, and a distant roll of thunder echoed through the valley, a low growl that promised violence. He worked with a desperate urgency, his body screaming with a fatigue that went bone deep. Using broken timbers from the old lean-to and piles of rock he'd already excavated, he started building a crude diversion wall, a barrier to channel the inevitable rush of water away from the mine's entrance. The rain came down in sheets, plastering his hair to his scalp and turning the dusty ground into a slick, treacherous mud. Shadow stood nearby, unbothered by the storm, his calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos of the elements. He seemed to trust Ethan implicitly, standing as a quiet anchor in the swirling wind and rain. The dry creek bed at the edge of the property was already beginning to fill, transforming from a dusty scar into a shallow, gurgling stream. Ethan knew that soon it would become a raging river. He had to work faster. It was then, through the gray, watery curtain of the downpour, that he saw it, a flickering lantern bobbing and swaying wildly in the distance down by the main track. He heard a faint shout, nearly swallowed by the roar of the wind, followed by the terrifying splintering of wood. He squinted, trying to pierce the gloom. A wagon, caught in the flash flood that was now consuming the road, had overturned. He didn't hesitate. The mine, the treasure, all of it faded into the background. There were people in trouble. He grabbed his lantern and called to Shadow, his voice tight with urgency. "Stay here, boy." The horse let out a soft whinny as if in understanding. Ethan slid and scrambled his way through the mud and rising water toward the wreck. He found a horrifying scene. A heavy farm wagon lay on its side, one wheel shattered. A man was pinned underneath, his face pale with pain, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. A woman, clearly pregnant, was trying frantically to free him, while a small child, no older than 4, sat crying in the mud, soaked and terrified. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, Ethan helped the woman, whose name was Mary Miller, dig the earth from around her husband. Together, they managed to pry the wagon up just enough for him to drag his crushed leg free. The man, John, was barely conscious. The storm was worsening, the floodwaters rising dangerously. Their meager belongings were being swept away. "We have to get to higher ground," Ethan yelled over the wind. "My place. It's not much, but it's dry." He half-carried, half-dragged John Miller, while Mary clutched their child, and they stumbled their way back toward his camp. He led them not to his own exposed sleeping spot, but to the one place he knew was safe and dry, the mouth of the mine. He settled them inside, just beyond the entrance, protected from the wind and the deluge. He gave them his only dry blanket, built a small, smoky fire with the few pieces of dry wood he had, and used strips torn from his own shirt to splint the man's leg. He had almost nothing, but what he had, he gave freely. All through the night, as the storm raged, Ethan Vance stood guard at the entrance, a solitary figure protecting a family of strangers, his blind horse a silent partner in his vigil. He had been tested, and he had chosen compassion over fortune without a second thought. By morning, the storm had broken. A weak, watery sun filtered through the clouds, illuminating a world washed clean and battered. The creek was still swollen, but had receded from its furious peak. John Miller was awake, his face tight with pain, but his eyes clear with gratitude. His wife, Mary, sat holding their sleeping child, looking at Ethan with an expression of profound thankfulness that made him feel both humbled and awkward. "We owe you our lives," she said, her voice soft but firm. Ethan just shook his head, murmuring that he'd done what anyone would have. As he helped John into a more comfortable position, the surveyor's professional eye caught the glint of the vein at the back of the small cavern. His eyes widened, first in curiosity, then in utter disbelief. He had worked in this region for years, mapping its contours and studying its geology. He knew the legends, the old tales of a lost mine filled with sky-colored stone. My God, he whispered, his own pain forgotten for a moment. Is that what I think it is? The lost azure. Word traveled as fast as the receding floodwaters. Once Ethan had helped the Millers right their wagon and secure it, John insisted on being taken into Redemption Gulch for a proper doctor. He refused to leave, however, until he had shaken Ethan's hand and promised to send help. The story he told in town was not of a treasure discovery, but of a quiet, selfless man who had sheltered his family from the storm of the century. The narrative of Vance's folly began to crumble. The town doctor, a practical man named Elias Rowe, came out to the property to tend to Ethan's own cuts and bruises after setting John's leg. He saw the mine, and his professional skepticism gave way to quiet awe. He returned to town and went straight to the assayer's office. Soon, a small, reverent procession began to make its way to Ethan's land. It wasn't a mob of gold seekers, but a community humbled and intrigued. The assayer, a meticulous man with spectacles perched on his nose, took samples from the vein. He performed his tests right there, by the light of a lantern, his silence drawing the small crowd of townspeople closer. Finally, he looked up, his expression one of pure astonishment. "It's the real thing," he announced, his voice carrying in the quiet air. "Turquoise and azurite of a grade I've never seen. Not in any book, not in any ledger. This vein, it will make this valley famous." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. They turned to look at Ethan, who stood quietly by the mine's entrance, his hand resting on Shadow's neck. They saw not a fool or a failure, but a man of impossible patience and quiet strength. The last to arrive was Silas Croft. He rode his fine horse right to the edge of the property, his face a mask of thunderous disbelief. He saw the expertly timbered entrance to the mine, work the grateful John Miller had already arranged. He saw the respectful faces of the townspeople, and he saw Ethan, standing not with arrogance, but with a simple, unshakable dignity. Their eyes met across the distance. Croft's arrogance finally broke. Without a word, he turned his expensive gelding around and rode away, defeated not by a show of force, but by the quiet, undeniable truth of what a $4 blind horse had found. The light of late afternoon slanted across the valley, turning the dust to gold and the distant mesas to shades of amber and rose. A sense of peace had settled over the small patch of land that Ethan Vance now called home. The mine was registered, the claims secured. John Miller, his leg healing, had used his surveyor's knowledge to ensure every legal requirement was met, his gratitude taking the form of meticulous paperwork. A steady stream of visitors had come and gone, geologists from distant cities, investors with quiet offers, and journalists eager for the story of the blind stallion and the lost mine. Ethan had met them all with the same quiet courtesy and an unwavering refusal to sell. He wasn't interested in their money. He was interested in stewardship. His one true friend from his old life, a freighter named Ben, had arrived with a wagon full of proper tools and supplies, having heard the news from a traveler. Ben was a plain-spoken man who had never lost faith in Ethan. He now stood beside him, looking at the mine entrance. "Never doubted you, Ethan," Ben said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Not for a minute. So what's the plan? You're the richest man in this territory now. Gonna build a mansion?" Ethan smiled, a rare, small upturning of his lips. He looked out over the land he had worked with his own 2 hands, the land that had nearly broken him and then had saved him. Shadow stood beside him, as he always did, his head resting gently on Ethan's shoulder in a familiar gesture of affection and trust. The horse's milky eyes saw nothing, but he seemed to feel the warmth of the setting sun, the contentment of his owner, the deep rightness of this place. Ethan ran a hand along the stallion's powerful neck, the coarse hair familiar and comforting beneath his calloused fingers. The sounds of the evening were settling in, the chirp of crickets, the distant call of a quail. This was his fortune, more so than any blue stone buried in the earth. It was the quiet, the peace, the sense of belonging he had thought was lost to him forever. He had arrived in Redemption Gulch with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of ghosts. Now he had a home, a purpose, and a companion whose loyalty was more precious than any mineral. He looked at Ben, his gaze clear and steady, and finally gave voice to the truth he had been learning all along. It was never about what was in the ground, he said, his voice low and certain. It was about learning to trust what the world throws away. Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet faith and hidden value. It's a powerful reminder that true worth isn't always what glitters, but is often found in the courage to care for the things that others have discarded. If this tale of patience and perception resonated with you, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more stories that dig beneath the surface. Our next journey takes us to a dusty attic, where a forgotten letter rewrote the history of an entire town. We hope you'll join us.